The December wind cut through Jake Morrison's worn leather coat like a knife through butter. He pulled his hat down lower as he guided his horse, Thunder, along the dusty main street of Cedar Creek, Texas. The town looked different now than it had 6 months ago when he'd last been through. Shop windows were decorated with paper snowflakes and red ribbons, and folks walked a little faster, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. Jake had been riding the range for 3 weeks straight, checking cattle and mending fences on the Double M Ranch. His boss, old Pete McGillicuddy, had given him time off for Christmas, but Jake wasn't sure what to do with it. He had no family left to speak of, and the bunkhouse would be empty with the other cowboys visiting their kinfolk. As Thunder's hooves clopped against the wooden planks of Main Street, Jake noticed a crowd gathered outside Murphy's General Store. Women in their Sunday best bonnets whispered to each other, while men in clean work shirts stood with their arms crossed. Something was happening, and in a town as small as Cedar Creek, news traveled faster than wildfire. Jake dismounted and tied Thunder to the hitching post outside the saloon. The November wind had turned bitter cold, and he could smell snow in the air. Christmas was only 2 weeks away, and the thought made his chest feel heavy. Last Christmas, he'd spent the day alone in the bunkhouse, eating cold beans and trying not to think about his ma's apple pie or his little sister's laughter. "Jake Morrison, is that you?" called out Mrs. Henderson from across the street. She was the banker's wife and knew everyone's business better than they knew it themselves. "Yes, ma'am." Jake tipped his hat politely. "Have you heard the news? We got ourselves a new school teacher, and she's staying at the boarding house all by herself for Christmas. Poor dear has nowhere to go and no family to speak of." Jake nodded, but didn't say much. He'd learned long ago that in small towns, sometimes it was better to listen than to talk. But something about Mrs. Henderson's words stuck with him. A woman alone at Christmas, just like he was a man alone at Christmas. He walked toward Murphy's General Store, curious about what had drawn the crowd. As he got closer, he could see through the window. A woman stood at the counter, her back to the street. She wore a dark blue dress that looked store-bought, not homemade like most women in town wore. Her brown hair was pinned up neat and proper, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that said she'd been educated somewhere beyond Cedar Creek. "That's her," whispered Tom Bradley, the blacksmith. "Miss Elizabeth Carter. Came in on yesterday's stage from back east. Pretty as a picture, but she's got that look about her like she's seen some trouble." Jake found himself staring longer than he meant to. There was something about the way she held her shoulders straight, but not stiff, that reminded him of his ma. His ma had been a strong woman, too, the kind who could deliver a calf in the morning and teach Jake his letters in the evening. The general store door opened with a little bell chime, and the woman stepped out. Jake got his first good look at her face. Tom Bradley was right about her being pretty. She had clear blue eyes and skin that hadn't been weathered by years of sun and wind like most folks in town. But there was something else there, too, a sadness around her eyes that she was trying to hide behind a polite smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just a trace of an accent Jake couldn't place. "Could you direct me to the boarding house? I'm afraid I've gotten turned around." Before anyone else could answer, Jake stepped forward and touched the brim of his hat. "It's just down the street, miss. The white house with the green shutters. Mrs. Patterson runs a good place." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, and her smile seemed more genuine this time. "You're very kind." Jake watched her walk away, noting how she stepped carefully around the mud puddles and how she kept her carpet bag clutched tight in her hand like it held everything she owned in the world. "That girl's got secrets," Mrs. Henderson said, appearing at Jake's elbow like she'd materialized out of thin air. "Mark my words, pretty young women don't come to places like Cedar Creek unless they're running from something." Maybe so, Jake thought, but everyone had secrets. He had his own share, including the fact that every Christmas Eve for the past 5 years, he'd made the same wish on the first star he saw. He'd wished for someone to share Christmas morning with, someone who'd understand that the holiday wasn't about fancy presents or big dinners, but about not being alone when the world felt cold and empty. That evening, Jake sat in the saloon nursing a single beer and thinking about the new schoolteacher. The place was nearly empty except for old Charlie, who was always there, and the traveling salesman who was staying the night before heading on to the next town. "She asked about you," said Mary, the saloon girl who sometimes served drinks when she wasn't upstairs with customers. "Who asked about me?" "The schoolteacher. She was in here earlier asking for directions to find some supper. I told her the hotel restaurant was closed for repairs, so she'd have to eat here or at the boarding house. She said she met a cowboy who was polite and helpful, and she wondered if he might be the kind of man who could help her find work for some of the older students." Jake nearly choked on his beer. "She was asking about me?" "Well, she didn't know your name, but she described you pretty good. Tall, brown hair, kind eyes, and a hat that's seen better days." Mary grinned. "I told her your name was Jake Morrison and that you were one of the good ones." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jake had spent most of the night thinking instead of sleeping, which wasn't like him at all. He was a practical man who didn't waste time on foolish notions. But something about Elizabeth Carter had gotten under his skin like a splinter. He was loading supplies into his saddlebags when he heard voices coming from the schoolhouse. School had been dismissed for Christmas break, but apparently Miss Carter was there anyway. Jake found himself walking toward the little white building before he'd consciously decided to do so. Through the window, he could see her arranging books on shelves and cleaning the blackboard. She'd taken off her coat, and he could see that her dress was well made, but not new. The sleeves were slightly frayed, and there was a small patch near the hem that had been sewn with care. Jake knocked on the door frame. "Miss Carter? I hope I'm not bothering you." She looked up, and again he saw the flash of wariness in her eyes before her polite smile took its place. "Not at all, Mr. Morrison. Jake Morrison. We met yesterday outside Murphy's store." "Of course. Please come in. I was just trying to organize things a bit." The previous teacher left everything in quite a state. Jake stepped inside and looked around. The schoolhouse was small but clean, with wooden desks arranged in neat rows and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. On the walls were maps and pictures of famous Americans, and on Miss Carter's desk was a small stack of books that looked well-read. "I heard you might be looking for work opportunities for some of the older students," Jake said, twisting his hat in his hands. Elizabeth's eyebrows rose slightly. "News travels quickly in small towns, doesn't it?" "Yes, ma'am, it does. I work for Pete McGillicuddy out at the Double M Ranch. We could use some help with winter chores, and Pete's always been fair about paying folks for honest work." For the first time since he'd met her, Elizabeth's smile reached her eyes. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mr. Morrison. Some of these children come from families that could use the extra income." They talked for a while about the students and the work available. Jake found himself relaxing in her presence. She was easy to talk to, and she listened like his words actually mattered. When he finally left to head back to the ranch, he was already thinking about reasons to come back to town soon. What Jake didn't know was that Elizabeth Carter stood at the schoolhouse window long after he'd ridden away, watching until his figure disappeared down the dusty road. And what neither of them knew was that Mrs. Henderson had seen the whole thing and was already planning how to make sure they found themselves in each other's company again before Christmas morning arrived. Elizabeth Carter had been in Cedar Creek for exactly 1 week when she realized that small-town life was nothing like the novel she'd read back in Boston. Every morning, she walked from Mrs. Patterson's boarding house to the schoolhouse, and every morning at least 3 people stopped her to ask how she was settling in, if she needed anything, and whether she'd given any thought to staying permanently. The truth was, she thought about staying every single day. Cedar Creek was the first place in 2 years where she'd slept through the night without waking in a cold sweat, listening for footsteps in the hallway or the sound of her name being called in anger. On Thursday morning, she was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when she heard the familiar sound of horse hooves on the main street. Without meaning to, she looked up, hoping to see a particular brown horse and its rider. Instead, she saw Jake Morrison's horse, Thunder, tied outside Murphy's general store, but no sign of Jake himself. Elizabeth had been thinking about Jake Morrison more than was proper for a single woman who'd come to town to start fresh. There was something about his quiet way of speaking and the way he looked at her like she was a person worth knowing, not just a pretty face or a problem to be solved. "Miss Carter," a young voice called out. She turned to see Tommy Bradley, the blacksmith's 12-year-old son, running toward her with his little sister Sarah in tow. Both children had their mother's red hair and their father's freckles, and both had been among her most eager students before the Christmas break. "Tommy, Sarah, what brings you here so early?" "Ma sent us," Sarah said, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "She wants to know if you'd like to come to our Christmas Eve gathering tomorrow night. The whole town's invited, and there'll be singing and apple cider and Mrs. Murphy's famous gingerbread cookies." Elizabeth's heart did something funny in her chest. Back in Boston, she'd spent last Christmas Eve locked in her room while her employer's family celebrated downstairs. She'd listened to their laughter and music through the floor and try to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. "That sounds lovely," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be imposing," Tommy said earnestly. "Ma says Cedar Creek takes care of its own, and you're